It's amazing to see this symposium because it's only in early 2009 when I literally bumped into Zoltan at pre-dinner drinks at St. John's College, and we discussed history. And he'd written a paper on Willis, and I'd written a paper on Hebb, which it turns out they sent him as a model for his paper on Willis. And he told me about Sherrington's box, and I kind of grabbed him by the short sleeves and said, come on, let's look at it, let's rip it open, let's tear it apart and see what's in it. And here we are. We wrote a paper on Sherrington, and it's all developed, and the amazing developments of John and Damien and Zoltan about the websites on the history. So a few years ago, I was yet again a visiting professor here. I'm more a visiting professor at home these days, I think. And we decided we should dig through the Gros Clark box. And my job is to find out about Gros Clark and write the kind of anecdotes and the bits and pieces to go with the slides that were being scanned in. And it turned out Gros Clark was far more interesting and complex than a person might think. And it starts with the naming, and some of these slides are not as good as I would have hoped. It's what happens when you send your student, you say, do you have a camera? Yes, go to the library and photograph all this stuff. And it turns out his camera is on his cell phone. And he had the most expensive cell phone. So this is the bust of Gros Clark, which is in the Gros Clark building. It's amazing you beg for a paper in Nature, and this building got its own paper in Nature. Department of Human Anatomy, Oxford, new building. Maybe you could write that. So the life of Gros Clark, it's like Elvis here. I thought your best thing in your 1950s slide was the beginning of rock and roll, to tell you the truth. I loved Elvis as a child. Let me tell you about the life of Gros Clark. I can't see it. I have to stand over here. Maybe I'm torn between how to do this. So Gros Clark was born in 1895, studied medicine. He ended up in the First World War and was not happy about that. It was quite traumatic. And if you saw the exhibit on medicine in the First World War at one of the museum that's about people, the National Portrait Gallery, the physicians and nurses were often more traumatized than the soldiers because they saw the mess that occurred after the war. So after the war, he was, quite traumatized. He decided to become a physician in Sarawak. Well, down here, Sarawak. And then he came back and was in hospitals in London. And then he began to do research on anatomy and evolution and primatology. He went to Africa to look at the skulls that Leakey and Broom and Dart had found. And much of the work I'm going to talk about is on his work on primates and human evolution. He was head of the Anatomical Society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He was involved in the Piltdown man forgery, in exposing the forgery, and died in 1971. Well, in doing the research for this, I dug through all of the archives in the Bodleian Library when it was temporarily in the Science Library. And my girlfriend, who's big into genealogy, looked up Gros Clark and said, do you realize his grandson is a professor at Cambridge? So I rang up, said, hi, doing a project on your grandfather. He said, you should ask my mother. I said, what? She said, oh yeah, she lives in London, she's still alive. So I said, why don't you meet me there one weekend? So last October, we trundled off during some big football match through the football crowds to somewhere, it's either Arsenal or somewhere. And we sat in the living room with his mother, and he produced a giant folder of letters. So this is the excitement of archaeology. You meet the daughter of the person you're interested in, the grandson, and a treasure trove, sort of like a dig for archaeology, a treasure trove of letters you might never know existed. I should say that Gros Clark wrote this autobiographical book. It's 10 chapters of autobiography. And I borrowed this from Ray Guillory and gave it to Zoltan to return. And so either Ray has it back or Zoltan has it, but I don't have it. I did not steal your book, Ray. Maybe I should have. So one of the interesting things is to go back in time, say, well, like who was Elvis's mentor? Who was everybody's professor? And that's how Gordon Shepherd started writing his book. He wanted to write a book about his professors from the 50s. So who was the Gros Clark's professors? Well, it goes back to Elliott Smith, Parsons, who he replaced, Keel and Woodallard. And there's actually this interesting book. I've emptied the Blackwell's bookstore in my visits to Oxford. And it talks about the earliest people interested in cultural anthropology, the brain and behavior in quote, unquote, primitive cultures, and how they're interested in head size and cranial capacity, which of course led into interest in evolution. Well, the Gros Clark did a lot of anatomy, medical anatomy, teaching, and comparative anatomy. He was very interested in comparative anatomy of the thalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus, visual pathways, a lot of other areas. And I'm making sure that I put them in bold. Cortical representations of visual stimuli. I now fit into the title of the symposium. But really, deep down, somewhere as a child, he must have read an exciting book, because he was really interested in how you can use comparative anatomy to study evolution, evolution of the primates, evolution of humans. And he wrote a book, Early Forerunners of Man, and he had this different areas, the skull, brain, special senses, limbs, etc., digestive system. So he looked at every system. And of course, we're interested in the brain, but the brain does not live on its own. And if you're looking at ancient peoples, what's left is not the brain, but the skull. So you deal with the skull. And so a lot of his work dealt with skulls, teeth, and bones. So comparative primatology and physical anthropology, the Gros Clark was a founder of both comparative primatology and physical anthropology. And you don't think of that as a neuroscientist and neuroanatomist would be involved in these things, but we've already heard some discussion of evolution this afternoon. He was involved, he was one of the three people involved, Wiener, Oakley, and the Gros Clark, in the Unmasking the Piltdown forgery. And he did that with a careful analysis of the teeth and jaws. In the original Piltdown skeleton, many experts looked at bits of the skeleton, but they never compared and contrasted what they found, or they might have noticed sort of human jaw and a chimpanzee head, or vice versa. So the Gros Clark died in 1971, left behind innumerable publications, and as happens with Fellows of the Royal Society, he had his obituary published in the biographical memoirs of the Fellows of the Royal Society. And his former student and a predominant scientist in Britain, Solly Zuckerman, wrote the article in the memoirs of the members of the Royal Society. And when I'm doing history research and the person was a fellow of the Royal Society, it's usually the gold standard. You go there and they have all their publications and their life and everything. And you start from there and then you look for details. Well, Zuckerman, when I read this biography, I thought something's a bit fishy. Zuckerman's comments: the Gros was physically inferior, had a bad stammer, did not accept criticism, shrank from controversy, enjoyed public recognition, wanted to be admirers, cold, reserved, and changeable. And I should have said this talk is co-authored by one of my students from my history class this year, Taung McGowan, and her comment was, why had this inspiring and kind man been painted as such a villain by his biographer? So we rooted around and found some articles about the Gros Clark and Zuckerman, and a person named Simon said, the biographical note is unbelievably condescending and should actually be called The Revenge of Lord Zuckerman. It says Zuckerman states that Clark took psychiatric treatment for his stammer, which is incorrect. So you think, okay, what's going on here? What is going on here? Why did his worst enemy write his definitive biography? So then we started really digging in the literature. And this is a short version of the story. So it all began with the Taung child in southern Africa. Raymond Dart discovered the Taung child in 1925 and said humans were evolved in Africa. Everybody said, no, 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 you're mistaken. That's a primate brain. Humans evolved in the Middle East, and they were white, not black. And then Robert Broom found an adult Australopithecus skull. And the Gros and his student, Zuckerman, said, nah, you guys are all wrong. There's nothing to suggest Australopithecus possessed cerebral anatomy, features indicative of humans. They're clearly monkeys. You guys don't know what you're talking about. So the battle began. And there's Robert Broom with Australopithecus. So there's the Taung child. There's Robert Broom digging around in Africa. And in 1949, Robert Broom wrote an article in Scientific American, November 1949, where he looked at the evidence of the skulls, the teeth, bones, and made a map of evolution. And what's interesting is there's Piltdown Man, because it wasn't discovered as a forgery till the 1950s, with a question mark by it. And there's Broom's evolutionary tree of humans. Well, let's go back to the good old days when we were pals. The Gros Clark and Zuckerman before they hated each other. The Gros Clark is Zuckerman's tutor, his professor at Oxford. Australopithecine did not demonstrate any human affinity. They both agreed on that. They wrote an article together. And they got together to study neuroendocrinology of ferrets. The Gros Clark was interested in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamic control of hormones was interested in Zuckerman. And they had a friendly and professional relationship. Well, the battle took place, and I got this great postcard from the Natural History Museum. You dig up one of these skulls in your backyard. Is it a modern human or an ancient human? You dig up in your backyard in Africa, is it an ancient human or an ancient monkey? And so you've got to try and sort out all these ancient skulls and what line they were in. And so the Australopithecine, the collection of letters I got from the Gros Clark's grandson is all the Broom side, so the Broom side of the conversation. I'll be forced to go to South Africa and dig up the Gros Clark's letters, I guess. Anyway, in 1940, the Gros Clark and Broom started a correspondence. I have 350 pages of correspondence from Broom alone, and there must be another 300 pages from the Gros Clark yet to be found. And teeth and bones were important in the argument, as well as the cranium, of whether these Australopithecine were primates or human. And Clark, in 1947, he changed his mind. He'd gone to South Africa. He came back and said, sorry, lads, Australopithecines were humans. Then all hell broke loose. First of all, that was taken as definitive. The world, and sort of like Eccles, exclaiming that there are neurotransmitters in the brain. When the Gros Clark said Australopithecines are related to humans, the world shifted, except for one person, Zuckerman. So, sorry about this one, it's a kid's cell phone. How do you analyze teeth? Much of the battle between the Gros Clark and Zuckerman came down to how do you analyze teeth and how do you determine whether they're teeth of chimpanzees or humans? And remember, teeth are what showed the Piltdown Man forgery. So Zuckerman said he'd written a letter to this guy Adolf Schultz complaining that the Gros Clark was wrong in saying these were humans. Zuckerman said you have to use proper statistics, and I put that in quotation marks, that evolution relies too much on intuition and emotion instead of real science. And in a seminar in physical anthropology, he said, well, the Gros Clark said it's humans, Zuckerman said it's apes. And then the modulator of the symposium, Kaplan, said, well, acceptance of results of Zuckerman's study would have to be withheld until such a time as the Australopithecine and human series and the hominid and anthropoid ape series have been compared in a like fashion. So you need to do real comparative neuroanatomy and anthropology. So by 1950 now, the Gros Clark is arguing that Australopithecines are human. Zuckerman is saying he didn't do it right and he's wrong. And the Gros Clark is saying Zuckerman doesn't know what he's talking about. And they're working down to teeth. It all comes down to teeth. And I've just been to the dentist, and I can tell you how important teeth are. And so they had a 6-month debate on statistics, human versus ape anatomy, and research methodology. And you can look this up because, again, I guess in those days, if you wanted a letter to Nature every week, you had a controversy. And they started and they went every week in Nature, South African fossil hominids by Zuckerman, reply by the Gros Clark, reply by Zuckerman, reply by the Gros Clark, reply by Zuckerman. You can feel the knives, stab, stab, You know, it's like, stab me in the back again. And so my student, Hagen, made these nice figures. So the Gros Clark employs statisticians at Oxford and criticizes Zuckerman's methods. Zuckerman wants to see the originals, doesn't get to see them. He's in Birmingham, all the way up in Birmingham. The Gros Clark hires his own statisticians. Zuckerman gets his statisticians. And so Zuckerman publishes the definitive statistical analysis on these teeth. Unfortunately, the Gros Clark statisticians show that they made many errors in their statistics, and when they do them properly, they prove the Gros Clark was right, not Zuckerman. End of argument, you think. So they argued about skulls. The skulls were human. The skulls weren't human. The skulls were so human. The skulls weren't human. You don't know what you're doing. 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 Posture. Did they drag their knuckles? It went on and on. So what's going on? How do you properly analyze teeth? Well, Zuckerman says you do a statistical analysis of teeth. Unfortunately, he did what many people do, not a multivariate analysis, but he took every parameter of teeth and did analysis of variance. And so he made lots of errors. So statistics. The Gros Clark said, well, you can't look at one tooth. You've got to look at the pattern of teeth. And so Bernowski and Long, the Gros Clark's colleagues, said, well, sorry, lads, your statistics were wrong. So these are the letters. And I used a copy stand at Cambridge 2 weeks ago. I did this. And these are these blue airmail letters used to get in the 50s. And unfortunately, the copy stand turned them all kind of yellow with the bright lights. But now, what's the Gros Clark doing? The Gros Clark is defending Broom's discoveries and argument that they're human. So it doesn't surprise you that around 1949, the letters start out to be what a moron Zuckerman is. Basically, I'm not being as subtle as the letters are. The letters actually, my girlfriend's job in the last 2 weeks has been to sit in front of her computer and read these 350 pages and tell me which ones to use in this talk. This one is about Zuckerman, and I think it begins with, burn this letter after you read it, because I'm going to say things that aren't polite. And some of them, unfortunately, stamp collectors have been at it, and they snipped off the stamp, but that's the envelope is the back side of the letter, so little chunks of some of the letters have vanished. This other one, many of the letters contain drawings of teeth, and they were drawn exactly as you draw them to publish them. And then the writing goes around the back of them, so you don't get the writing coming through on the other side, and the writing continues on the envelope that was used. And so we're trying to decipher all of these. But this is the Gros Clark's information. And one critique of the Gros Clark was that he spent half an hour looking at these brains and decided they were human. But he'd actually spent 7 years at this time corresponding with Broom. From 40 to 47, it's all during the Second World War. So sometimes letters take forever to get there. And then as soon as the war was over, he went and examined them. So a fascinating treasure trove of original drawings from Broom. Zuckerman argued for statistics, proper scientific practice, and he wrote an article on, the science of anthropology and archaeology. Should be, I kind of laugh at this one. When you're studying archaeology, you should work in the laboratory. And he opposed a number of methods. The Gros Clark wanted to work with simple apparatus and experiments and didn't think you needed very fancy analytical equipment. He continued, the Gros Clark, to write a number of books on fossil evidence for human evolution and some of the discoveries he'd found and how Zuckerman was wrong. And then Zuckerman kept writing about how the Gros Clark was wrong. So Lawrence Gary, one of his students, has written some articles on the Gros Clark. He tried to keep aloof from politics. Zuckerman was deep into politics as a scientific advisor to the government. And despite being head of department, he disliked administration. I sympathize with that. Zuckerman, these are not my words. I'm careful to put the references there. He liked to pour scorn on successors, criticized others, patriarch of his family, competitive and offhand with his children. I didn't know him, so I can't say this, but you begin when you do this, do you find yourself taking sides? Since I'm in Oxford, into the Gros Clark building, I think I'm taking the Gros Clark side. I guess I'm not an unbiased historian. So the controversy, the Gros Clark said, well, Zuckerman fanned the flames, he hired statisticians, and tried to compete. The Gros Clark tried to bring other people into the game. Zuckerman said the argument was started by the Gros Clark, that his letter criticizing Clark was confidential, and that it was Clark that started the argument. And so he attacked Clark. It's rather interesting. So who won the battle? Well, deep down, I feel the Gros Clark won the battle, but there's another side. In applying to a controversial issue which has arisen in regard to certain teeth of the Australopithecus, they're able to resolve the controversy by demonstrating very positively their hominin character. That's the Gros Clark's own book. Zuckerman and Ashton have been discredited. Zuckerman never felt discredited and continued attacking the Gros Clark even after he died. And this is the Gros Clark's 55 book, his last book on, apes. Now, isn't that interesting? What have I done now? Go back a bit. This is the stuff at the end that I didn't know where to put in. So historical truth, hard to figure out the historical truth. Everybody's dead. I only know the Gros Clark's grandkids. I guess I should meet Zuckerman's grandchildren. Are you in the audience? Are you going to shoot me? Have to rely on historical documents where they exist, and this is what Gordon was saying, that the older things are, the less likely are to exist. Imagine I had not found the Gros Clark's grandson last year, and he was moving home and said, I don't need all this junk of my grandfather's, let's throw it out. Then it would be gone. I'm convinced him to put it in the Bodleian Library when the time comes. So biographies are written after death. I found this book in the Dal Library, Bones of Contention, in which there's one chapter, and I just found it a few weeks ago, on the Gros Clark Zuckerman controversy. This is a book by Chris Stringer, who's at the National Museum here, and he did the exhibit on 10 million years of history of humans in Britain, and it in 2012 book indicates the controversy of what fossils are human and what apes continues today. And so we had money from the Wellcome Trust, Dalhousie, Deepak, Roger Hardy is in Cambridge, is the Gros Clark's grandson, and Natasha and Eric helped me put this together and did the photos. So it's sort of exciting doing this stuff. It's finding little treasure troves, not quite like when your mouse behaves properly in your experiment, but almost the same for an old guy. So thanks very much.